Welcome to Derm-It Trotter. Don't swear about skincare, where host Dr. Shannon C. Trotter, a board-certified dermatologist, sits down with fellow dermatologists and skincare experts to separate fact from fiction and simplify skincare. Let's get started.
Well, welcome everyone again to the Derm-It Trotter Don't Swear About Skincare podcast. We have a special topic we're going to talk about today, clinical trials. Might make you think twice about wanting to continue to listen, but stay tuned. We're really going to show you why clinical trials, or basically just research with new medications, devices, are so important, especially in the world of skin. And I've got a great guest on today, Dr. Rocco Serrao. He's a board-certified dermatologist who does both general and medical dermatology, most of his time seeing patients and acting as a principal investigator of clinical trials. He's a head honcho in these studies, guys, so he's an expert. He really enjoys teaching medical students, residents, and his fellow clinicians, and he spends his free time with his husband, Mark, 3-year-old daughter, Madeline, and their dog, Sydney. So I'd really like to welcome Dr. Serrao here to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Shannon. I'm excited to be here and discuss a little bit of what I do, clinical trials in our practice.
Yeah, you're really making a difference. And I think that's what, Dr. Serrao and I really want to highlight today, that clinical trials are really important. They're the foundation, for medications and devices and all the things we want to offer patients to move forward. So if you've been prescribed something or your docs maybe recommended a particular treatment, this is where it started. So I really want Dr. Serrao to kind of open up the conversation and just really explain, what is a clinical trial?
Yeah, Shannon. So in medicine, we still have some unmet needs, right? And clinical trials are research studies that are really developed to test, manage, and treat various health conditions. And these health conditions have an unmet need. The goal, though, with these trials is to understand disease states better and advance tests and treatments for these disease states. And in derm, some of these disease states that come to mind are alopecia areata, hidradenitis suppurativa, atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, right? So diseases where we have some therapies, but we just haven't really maximized the benefit we can give to our patients.
And I think that's where we're kind of coming up with, there are patients, like you said, that something's working for, there's a treatment. But I know some of you listeners out there, is one of the things we have to think about, that maybe you've tried some of those treatments that are the latest and greatest, and you're like, hey, what's next? And that's really what we're getting at. That's where clinical trials start. But what you may not realize is that there's different types of clinical trials. And so I'm going to let Dr. Serrao just kind of explain that a little bit, because I think it is confusing. Do you mind going over that a little bit for us?
So Shannon, when I think of clinical trials, I think of two kind of main broad categories. And I think of clinical trials as being like observational trials or interventional trials, and then the different phases of clinical trials too. So let's briefly get into these. So interventional studies are what we typically utilize at our center. And what an interventional study does is it tests or tries out an intervention. And that can be a potential drug, a medical device, an activity, or procedure in people, so in human beings. This is commonly referred to as like our clinical trial. Now, observational studies, on the other hand, they don't test potential treatments. Instead, researchers observe like participants on their current treatment and see how they do over time. They plan and track health outcomes. So those are the kind of the two main types of trials I think of. And then there's the phases of trials, right? So trials go into preclinical development, and this is where you think of like the benchtop, and then that transition into like the clinical setting. And at the benchtop, at a clinical center or at an academic center, we think of like pipettes, and we think of like non-human subjects, right? Where those are like primates or whether they're rats, et cetera, kind of really preclinical testing for safety of these drugs and potentially to see why they may work from an immunopathologic standpoint. So why would they work in humans? Then they get past preclinical testing, and that's where centers like ours can really kind of where centers like ours can be a benefit. So phase 1 trials, let's talk about these first. These are trials that we don't typically do. These are small trials, and they're primarily concerned with establishing a new drug's safety. So not does the drug work, is it safe in small, healthy populations? These aren't patients with the disease state. These are healthy volunteers. You're going to test the drug on it and see how it does, right? How is the drug absorbed? How is it distributed? How is it metabolized? How is it excreted? How does the human body deal with this drug? All right, these are called pharmacokinetics. Then the drug can advance on to phase 2, okay? And about maybe 25, 30% will go on to phase 2, all right, to make sure these small, healthy individuals tolerate the drug well, and it's appropriate to go on. Then once in phase 2, this is where centers like ours really pick up, and we participate in these trials. So phase 2 trials are where these placebo-controlled trials, you may have heard of those words, start to really come into fruition. So we look at a drug, you want to determine if it's effective and if it's safe for a particular disease state with smaller numbers of people than like phase 3 trials. So 100 to 200, 100 to 300 volunteers. And then we want to ask the questions. Does drug X like improve the disease we're treating, right? Does it help? Does it give some sort of benefit above what's available currently? So not benefit in general, but benefit above what's available, right? Because we have lots of drugs, say like psoriasis, but you're not going to develop a drug that works not as good as what's available, right? So you want something that works better than what's available.
Makes sense.
The second objective is to see like what's the right dose and what's the right like frequency of dosing, right? So you might test multiple doses out, see what works best for the disease state you're at hand. So once that's answered, and if the drug is effective, and of course you're looking at safety, and if it's safe, then the drug will advance into phase 3. And only about like 30% of trials make it past phase 2, right? So phase 1, looking at safety in healthy volunteers. Phase 2, looking at efficacy and safety in patients that have a disease state. And then phase 3 are these studies you're most kind of comfortable, most familiar with. These are the studies that are conducted at multiple centers, several hundred to thousands of patients with whom the drug is tested. And we have massive testing of the drug to make sure this drug is safe and effective. And that's the whole point. And these studies tend to be randomized, meaning that when you enroll in one, you're either given the drug or a placebo or like a vehicle, we say in topical treatments, by chance, right? So you're either going to get the drug or not, and that is all randomized by chance. So we don't choose where you go. You either get the drug or get the vehicle by chance. And then phase 3 trials will then advance over time. And that's the data you see in a phase 3 trial is we're going to see in the labeling and the packaging if it's FDA approved, okay? And about 1 in 4 drugs makes it. So 1 in 4 drugs that exits preclinical testing makes it through phase 3 for submission to the FDA. And once it's submitted to the FDA, now about like 20% of drugs get approved. So again, not all the drugs are going to get approved for these disease states, but that's kind of how they advance along. So what you can tell a patient, or what you can think of as an individual with a disease that's thinking about going into a clinical trial, is the further along in development these drugs are, the more and more safety data we're getting, and the more and more efficacy or how well the drug works data we're getting. So if you enroll in a phase 1 trial, that's a little more of a risk than enrolling in a trial that's in phase, say, 3, for example. So those are the 3 main phases. There is phase 4. In phase 4 are studies of drugs that typically already approved for use, but we see how they how they behave or how effective they are and how safe they are in real world clinical practice. So those are phase 4 studies as well. So again, the further along you get in phases, the more safety you see and the more efficacy you have in a drug. So there tends to be less risk associated with being in that trial. But keep in mind, though, these are clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and before they're approved by the FDA, there can be risks that we don't know about. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're going to perhaps want to volunteer yourself into a clinical trial.
I think that's fascinating. We went through a lot of information, but it is important. I think you did a great job sort of outlining that just to kind of explain to people in that simple just rule of thumb. The further along in that clinical trial, like you said, the more we know about safety, potential risk, and efficacy. Because I think that is one of the things, we sort of see now, especially myself being newer to clinical trials as an investigator, is just, a little bit of, reluctance, or there's a little bit of suspicion, I think a little bit of that fear, especially post-COVID. We've all seen it in healthcare where, the public, many of our listeners, trusting the healthcare system, doctors, insurance, we've seen that decline, unfortunately, over time. So what would you say, to a patient that's thinking about, why should I participate in a clinical trial? What's the potential value to me or maybe to the greater good?
Right. So you kind of hit the nail on the head with both those. So there's a greater good contribution, right? So with more patients being studied within a disease state, we get overall understanding of how the disease behaves. So for example, the more patients that we have in clinical trials for, say, a disease state such as eczema or atopic dermatitis, the more we understand how atopic dermatitis behaves. And this is because there's two things that happen. Either a drug is developed, doesn't work. It's like, that's not how atopic dermatitis kind of behaves, because that pathway, that drug just didn't work. And then we see a drug that really is gangbusters as well. Like, oh, this is kind of onto something here, So this pathway is really relevant to atopic dermatitis. And the only way we know that is from real world data, right? And by real world, I mean like clinical trial data. Drugs that are tested in controlled environments on human subjects. The second thing is we're advancing treatment development, which we talked about. So again, potentially better therapies than those that are currently available. We have to fill an unmet need, okay? So this can be that you've tried everything out there and it's not worked for you with your disease state. This can mean that you are a certain age that the drug's not approved for, right? So say you're like 8 years old and you have a condition where, or your child or your loved one's 8 years old, or they have a condition that has no effective therapies, but there's something available for someone that's an adult, right? That's an unmet need. So again, you're trying to like advance the therapies, advance disease understanding. And then finally, it's potential for personal benefit, right? You can help yourself or you can help like a loved one, relief from their disease burden. So those are the two main categories. Those are the two main reasons you would do this, right? Help the greater good. And then of course, like help yourself. Like if your disease is controlling you and you're not in control of your disease and nothing's helped or nothing's available, then a clinical trial might be right for you. So it's like an alternative treatment option when these standard therapies like just aren't accessible or not helping you.
So Rocco, I think that was a great summary. You really highlighted for us, how doing a clinical trial can benefit the patient individually, but then also contribute, like you said, to the greater good or to healthcare as a whole to really help us find good treatments. And then also, I think on the flip side, maybe help us eliminate treatments we thought might be good, but maybe in the end don't work as well as maybe what we first suspected. And I think a lot of people wonder then, if these clinical trials are available, who's sort of behind the scenes, sponsoring these? Like who's responsible for bringing these to your office, to my office, or to institutions to actually make them happen?
Yeah. So in 2024, the majority of clinical trials are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies are investing in drugs and therapies to provide benefit for an unmet need, right? So that's the majority of the dollars are from pharmaceutical companies. There are, though, government grants that provide funding for some studies, but the majority are pharmaceutical companies. But there's oversight, right? So it's not like these pharmaceutical companies can test us and test patients and like guinea pigs, right? You're not out there and you're not like just being tested haphazardly. There's oversight, right? And institutional review boards or IRBs provide oversight to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects in trials. So there's independent organizations that are monitoring the safety and welfare of every single person in a trial. So keep that in mind, okay? So pharmaceutical companies may sponsor it, but they certainly don't have a say in how the trial is being conducted, okay? It has to be conducted in accordance with declarations that protect your rights as a human research subject. And IRB is that body that's independent of the company, the pharmaceutical company, that oversees the welfare and, again, the rights of the human subjects.
So you mentioned, just previously, we talked about the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, helping really keep us those high ethical standards. And I think it leads to the patient always asking, and coming to me when they've looked at maybe going into a clinical trial, how am I protected? So how do you explain to patients that they are protected, there are safeguards in place to really ensure that they have, coverage when they're in a clinical trial and that the trial is being held to a high ethical standard?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shannon. So research is highly regulated, and the risk safety of the participant is the primary ethical consideration of all trials. Now, in order for a study to be conducted, safeguards have to be in place, including this approval we talked about by an institutional review board. Now, the institutional review board does protect the safety and rights of the patients, but then again, so does the principal investigator at the site, okay? And so does the FDA. So the FDA also has oversight over a trial too. And the sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies, hire organizations as well to make sure the study is being completed in a manner that is consistent with the informed consent or with the process that the subject or patient or yourself you're in a trial agreed to. That brings us to the informed consent, though. So what the informed consent is, it's a document that reviews the study entirely. It gives you as a potential participant, okay, complete understanding of the trial, the ins and outs of the trial. The investigator and study staff are always available to answer any questions you have about the trial design, about the conduct of the trial, the whole time you're in the trial. And if at any point you want to exit the trial, you certainly can. Remember, clinical trials are elective. You can enter them at your own, due to your own, because you want to, and you can exit them because you want to. No one can keep you in a trial, right? And
Important to know,
so
yeah.
the whole time, the ball's like kind of in your court.
And I think that's really good you highlight that, because I think it's that concept of, like you said, informed consent, or what sometimes we call autonomy, that the patient, you're ultimately in the driver's seat. And just because you agree to participate in a clinical trial, I mean, you can withdraw at any point in time if you changed your mind. And I think people just understanding that freedom, all those protections that we've mentioned so far that are in place, could help give some reassurance or make people feel comfortable, maybe considering if it's the right choice for them. If they're kind of thinking about that in your office, or if you had somebody out there that's listening that might even, not even for a skin condition, but maybe they're looking at cancer treatment or something else that's going on in their life for a clinical trial, what types of questions would you tell the patient to maybe think about before they consider participating in a clinical trial?
Yeah. So one thing, clinical trial, you look at the risk and benefit of going to the trial, right? What interventions are currently available for me? And are those interventions what's right for me, right? This is all about the shared decisions. So you have to talk to your provider, and you have to look at your goals and expectations as a patient. And that provider needs to use their to care, right? Their expertise, and you have to handshake. And if there's nothing out there that you find is right for you, and your clinician or your provider finds is right for you, then there may be other options available through clinical trials, right? And a lot of these things are investigational. So keep in mind, these therapies may or may not work, all right? So I would say when you look at like standard of care, typically it's what's available at that time. And if nothing is right for you, then consider a clinical trial, right? Or if nothing is available for you, then maybe consider a clinical trial. I do find some resources available to kind of look into clinical trials, and you can kind of see what certain criteria are to meet and be able to participate in that trial. One website is trialstoday.org. I was actually looking at it today, and what's nice about trialstoday.org is it allows you to put in a disease state. So say you have, let's just put down psoriasis, and then it asks for your gender. So your gender assigned at birth. So I put male, and then it asks for your age, and then it asks for your zip code. Then it gives you a radius to search, and then you do that, and you can find, within your area there are X number of trials listed. Then you kind
Oh,
of read basic criteria. What do you have to, what inclusion and exclusion criteria are there? So what things do you have to meet, and what can you not have to be maybe a participant? Then it gives you contact information. So you can call that center, and then you can talk to their research team and see if that trial may be right for you. What you also want to do, though, is loop in your family doctor, your providers that right? Your healthcare team, if you're if you're even considering a trial. And then if you do go in the trial, you want them to be looped in as well. So again, this is like using the whole healthcare team to help better your overall health. And a trial can sometimes do that.
and in the last couple of minutes we have, I think one of the things patients always ask, is I don't understand what placebo versus open label means. And when the trial ends, like if by chance I did get the medication, will I still have access to it, especially if it was working for me? How would you explain kind of the possibility that may happen? I know it can vary per trial, obviously.
Yeah. So we talked about those phases, phase 2 and phase 3 trials. Typically, these trials you're gonna get the investigational product. We call that IP, which is the drug under investigation, or the therapy under investigation, or the intervention under investigation, versus a placebo. And a placebo is a substance or treatment with no therapeutic effect. Okay, but you don't know what you're gonna get. You could get the drug that has a potential therapeutic effect, the investigational product, or you may get the placebo. Sometimes if you're doing a topical study, it's called a vehicle. And all that is, it's what the investigational product would be in. So for example, if it's like a petroleum-based ointment, you would get the petroleum-based ointment and not the active ingredient. So you're either going to get the placebo or the investigational product, or like the vehicle investigational product. And at some point in that trial, typically like at a certain week, okay, If you were unlucky enough to receive the placebo or not the active drug, you're going to be switched over typically to receive the active drug. So, if I can make it X number of weeks, I know past that time point, I'm going to be on the therapy that's being studied. You don't know if the therapy works or not, but you're going to be on that therapy. Another thing to keep in mind is when a trial is being conducted, say the trial, let's put a number out there, is going to be 300 weeks. During that trial, there are committees meeting, okay? They're assessing the safety and efficacy of the drug to make sure that it is meeting certain criteria. So they wouldn't have a study for a drug that doesn't work go 300 weeks. They're going to do cuts of data during that time period to see if it's worth continuing the trial. So you're not going to be stuck for 300 weeks with a drug that doesn't work. They're going to know at a certain time point whether the benefit's being afforded or not. So you're not like out that long. Also, can you get the drug, so say the therapy works and the trial's wrapping up, so it's hitting week 300, do you still have access to that drug? Well, it's not a clear-cut answer here, right? Some drugs are FDA approved before the trial ends. And if you have access to that drug, typically you have to have some sort of commercial insurance, or the drug company has certain grants that can provide you access. Yes, you can continue. If that drug is not FDA approved, you probably won't be able to get that drug, even if it worked on you, until it becomes commercially available. If the trial ends, that tends to be uncommon. If a trial is ending and the drug's not FDA approved, typically that drug probably has low chance at that point of actually being approved. Now, open label is what I talked about. It's kind of after that time point when you were on placebo, you're going to be guaranteed some sort of drug. At that point in your mind, you're going to get it. And either the trial becomes unblinded, meaning everybody's getting the drug and we all know who's getting what, or it remains blinded, but patients may be on different dosing arms. So someone may be on high dose, someone may be on low dose. We know they're on active therapy beyond a certain time point.
That's a great summary, I think, to be honest with patients, because I think that's one of the questions I always have is, am I going to get the medicine or not? And I know clinical trials, maybe not our sexiest topic. I know here on the podcast, a lot of people are thinking, why are we doing this? Well, it's really the foundation of medicine and where we move forward, and whether it's dermatology and studying skin conditions and skin diseases that we need treatments for, or other areas of medicine. So I hope that gave a broader understanding to everyone out there about the clinical trial process, and maybe you'll consider it if it's something that's right for you. But I want to thank Dr. Serrao for coming on, giving a great summary of clinical trials for us. And hopefully, again, some of you out there will convince yourselves it might be the right fit for you or for somebody else to contribute not only to the greater good of medicine, but also for yourself if you have a tough condition out there and treatments have been exhausted. And also, if you're looking for Dr. Serrao, he's kind of a ghost on the social media front, but you can find him at docsdermgroup.com. He's a part of Docs Dermatology, so check him out there. And again, Dr. Serrao, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Shannon. It's an exciting time to be in dermatology. Like if you look at HS alone, there's over 170 clinical trials ongoing for HS right now, right? Huge unmet disease, a huge unmet need, right, in this disease state. So again, if you know someone that's suffering with it, if you're suffering with it, if your patients are suffering with it, and you are your wits in and don't know what to do, and I think we all have HS patients in mind, right? You can find a trial for them, right? Or a potential trial for them to maybe alleviate some of that burden of disease, right? For this disease state that has a huge unmet need. So, and that's one disease state amongst many in derm. So we're kind of blessed in derm that we have a lot of innovation happening. And these clinical trials can really help our patients and ourselves, like keep abreast of like the cutting edge developments that are happening.
Well said. I couldn't say it any better. Stay tuned for the next episode of Derm-It Trotter. Don't swear about skincare.
Thanks for listening to Derm-It Trotter. For more about skincare, visit dermittrotter.com. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with anyone who needs a little skincare sanity. Until next time, stay skin smart.